we're very excited to hear your session, but I wanted to pick your brains a little bit before all of the chaos of the day. What I've been hearing in the CISOs that I've been chatting to before Security Edge is that they feel forced into a compliance first mindset. But I've heard you say previously that leadership goes beyond meeting standards. Can you give me an example of a common misstep, that CISOs are making when engaging with regulators or boards, and what do they need to do differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a common trap to fall into is just focusing on compliance. Compliance is actually a trajectory. And when I look at all the roles that I've worked in, there's always a compliance agenda to be met, whether it's your own policies or regulatory mandates, or usually a combination of the two, because policies are literally typically a reflection of the various regulatory mandates that you need to meet on a regular basis. But we mustn't forget that our main role is to prevent a major cyber crisis happening within the organization. So it's important to focus on some of those essential control, that will be the first thing, and some of those crown jewels, and then work your way beyond that and keep compliance as a trajectory that you're going to be aiming for. I think the way to do this is obviously had to have a more of a kind of risk-driven mindset. So shifting away from compliance checkbox to risk-based decision-making, which aligns to business goals and resilience. That's crucial. And then secondly, I think it's more about business integration. So the business is obviously needs to be seen as a key part of cybersecurity. So linking cybersecurity to maybe a competitive advantage, which then means that if compliance to some degree is seen as a competitive advantage to the business, then they'll engage in that compliance agenda. And then I guess the third thing is you won't make any progress in this case unless you've been able to have some kind of executive influence. So if you're not able to communicate your compliance objectives in kind of risk terms or business terms, then you'll not be able to make any progress anyway, even on the first stage, which is before you get to compliance. So they'll look at some of the key areas I think that are super important. So just to summarize, is compliance as a trajectory, but the most important thing is thinking about it as a kind of business objective. Preventing a major cyber crisis is when you need to be thinking as a starting point.
It's really empowering advice for our Aussie CISOs. And Dan, beyond your time at Standard Chartered Bank, you've been helping organizations move beyond regulatory scrutiny to becoming trusted in leadership. When a company is in hot water, they've been breached, what can they do to rebuild that credibility with their regulators, with board, internally within the company itself?
Yeah, sometimes the organization has not necessarily been breached or had a breach of security, but it could be as simple as what regulators do is they tend to compare you to other organizations. And what you don't want to be is the lagging organization, because what regulators are concerned about is if you're the weak link within the ecosystem, then essentially you could end up being a systemic risk to a broader ecosystem. And that's quite crucial in things like critical national infrastructure or global banking regulatory frameworks and the way you sit within that ecosystem. So making sure that you're not the weakest link in that. So you'll have to be very proactive with regulators and be very transparent about where you sit today, but where you're aiming for in the very near future. And when it comes to regulators, one of the things that they crucially need to understand is where your risk appetite is and what you're doing to reach that risk appetite. That's the first thing. And obviously that needs to be very well communicated so you board down, because they're very much involved in setting that risk appetite. So the first thing is that you need to own that narrative, and you need to be constantly educating your board executives in those committee organizations. So there's a proactiveness required. You can't sit back and wait for regulators to be asking you the questions. You need to be on the front foot. That's the first thing. I've already talked about this the level of transparency needs to be happening all the way down the organizations. And transparency is best illustrated through metrics. So you need to have a good set of metrics that illustrate your risk appetite, the next layer down of management metrics, and then maybe a bunch of technical metrics as well. And the way regulators do this compare and contrast between you and your peers, they use typically three the metrics. So this demonstrates that you're being transparent, but you're also demonstrating an element of anti-intelligence, because we often think that cybersecurity leaders are responsible for leading all these compliance metrics, when actually it's not. You've got accountable executives in maybe the business, you've got the other IT teams that are responsible for applying those controls, making sure that you've demonstrated the accountability is really important. And I guess the third thing is you need to be helping the board feel confident, because it's not just you as a senior cybersecurity professional who engages with regulators. Quite often board members have to go and they have to be ready to answer quite detailed questions sometimes about cybersecurity and your maturity and how do they compare to peers. So for board members to have that confidence when going into those meetings, there's a requirement for you to be engaging regularly with board members and executive teams so that they feel ready to answer those questions. So that means you'll need to do that on a one-to-one basis. A committee where you may only get 15, 20 minutes is not enough. So that's super important to do that kind of educational piece for boards and executives on a regular basis.
And speaking of communicating to the board, we've been now asking CISOs about AI-driven cyber threats, those have been scaled. But on the flip side, AI also holds the potential to automate security.
Yeah,
How
absolutely.
should cyber, how should they cut through that hype and articulate the real risks and opportunities of AI in a way that the board can actually understand?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Just a couple of weeks ago, actually, I was educating a bunch of board of directors from Nigeria who come over to Singapore. So the Singapore Institute of Directors Forum was an opportunity for me to educate them on some of the issues surrounding AI in particular. And we've got this, what I would call an AI paradox, I think, that we've got there, where on the one hand, we've got AI is potentially an automated threat to the organization. But on the other hand, you've got this opportunity to be using AI as an automation to defend and automate your defensive measures against AI. I think it's important when we think about AI in both defensive and offensive in terms of we being attacked, is making sure that we've got very clear parameters with which we're working in, because if you could introduce so much automation into your own AI defensive capabilities that you begin to lose control, and that would be a worse outcome. Clear governance is required whenever you introduce any of these new AI features and you test them out. And one of the things that I've found has worked particularly well when we've introduced any kind of new AI capabilities for a defensive measure is red teaming. Red teaming is a really good way to test out, almost in a safe way, that what you're putting in place is fit for purpose. So that's super important. The second thing is that when it comes to AI and cutting through some of the hype, is to understand that some of those measures that we traditionally use in cybersecurity are also really important to apply. And secure by design is a principle that's used a lot in cybersecurity. How can we use secure by design as a concept, or secure by default as a concept, when we're bringing in new capabilities that are AI, maybe for the business, to help them with AI capabilities in the business, whether that's helping with onboarding clients or helping them with some of the products. So those embedding the shift left principles are super important. And that's all about pre-deployment testing, and then some of that continuous monitoring, if you like, of those different products or services that include AI. So that's more broadly within the organizations. You don't really want something to be going live that has not only got vulnerabilities, but has got automated AI on automated AI. So that's an important aspect. And then the last thing I think in this space is disinformation risk, and deepfake is one of those clear examples where AI powered attacks like deepfakes, disinformation will require proactive countermeasures. So obviously you're going to need all the detection tools and authentication tools and human oversight, but you're going to require quite a lot of manual intervention in terms of education with sport executives, particularly those individuals that are going to be coming under some of these attacks. And we've seen plenty of examples of extortion attempts around the world when you get in this kind of automation of traditional attacks in fraud be enabled by some of the automation around AI. And I saw this as a big concern that was raised in the World Economic Forum recent release of a paper that they put forward on AI. And so that will be the key 3 areas that I think are super important to be aware of.
And in our own research, we're finding a real strain in resources. 2/3 of Australia's leading CISOs are telling us they need 50% more resources to achieve cyber resilience.
Yeah.
In your experience, what are those underrated levers CISOs can pull to gain that influence and that funding without having to wait for a crisis?
Yeah, so this is a big one, right? We talk about this in the cyber leadership community a lot. How do we help new emerging cyber leaders who have just maybe moved into a new CISO role, or they've been in there for CISO roles for a while, but now they need to unlock new areas of funding? I think the first thing is recognizing that culture's the most important thing that you need to be transforming across your organization. And you need to be getting the senior leaders involved in that narrative. So I still believe that one of the most important things that we can do very early on into our tenure, but certainly on a regular basis, is to do regular crisis simulations. Regular crisis simulations serve 2 purposes. One, they're a really good opportunity for you to educate senior executives about just how impactful a major crisis could be. And that's super important. And I'll give you a really good example of where I've been running one organization, not as early as I wanted to, but I think it was about 8 months in. And on doing a major cyber crisis, the CEO tapped me on the shoulder as I walked out of this briefing that we'd done, very in-depth. It was almost like a day we'd done with them. And it went down, and that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. We really stress tested some of our playbooks. He says, but I wish you'd done this sooner, Darren. You would have got double the amount of funding that you asked for. So I was like, in the one hand, I was quite pleased that it found a lot of value from it. But in the one hand, I was kicking myself for not doing something sooner, because when you run these, there's almost like a no-win scenario. And sometimes the only option that they've got is to pay a ransom to get decryption keys back. When they realize that there might even cease to be a going concern as an organization, they'll reflect and think, we can't afford to have this. What do we need to spend to make sure that this is a reduced impact on our organization, or doesn't even affect us at all, and we don't even have to have the option of paying ransoms? And by the way, those options of paying ransoms are going away anyway, because even though your insurance provider may say, yeah, you've got 200 million to pay out for ransomware, that actually many regulators around the world are now clamping down on this. So you're not even allowed to make those payments. So not even having that option becomes a major problem. I think the other thing as well is when you're trying to unlock funds from senior business leaders in particular and board executives, is you really need to be positioning cyber as a business enabler. Because I'll give you an example. I worked for a global fintech in the UK, very successful fintech, created in pretty much every country around the world. It's called IHS Market, which was then bought by S&P Global. And the CEO there, Lance Ugler, who I was very close to, even in the interview phases of me getting that global CISO role, was very clear with me that he really wanted to see cybersecurity being positioned as an enabler from the business. And if any CISO gets an opportunity to do a role like that where the CEO already gets it, grab that with both hands. It's a fantastic opportunity. But one of the things that I was able to link very closely to his agenda in the business was that he saw that quite clearly in the conversations that I was having with him, that if we could make his organization more secure, there were no regulatory requirements required, by the way. But if he could operate at the same level as all the banks, then when the banks did a third-party assessment of our organization, they wouldn't see us as a risk and therefore more likely to do business with us. That just becomes a critical business enabler right there. So he always saw cybersecurity as a business advantage, and he used to say that a lot. And it was a narrative that we continue to push right through the organization. So you got more of the pull from the organization rather than a push. So that was super important. The last thing is just obviously linking risk to business value. You always need to do that. And when you get within risk appetite, you can start to see a financial impact of, if you don't have a breach, then potentially you'll save yourself having this amount of money. And of course, the big thing is that shareholder value is going to be impacted if you have a major cyber crisis as well. So that goes without saying. You don't want to be using the fear tactic too much, but you have to certainly include that in the narrative because it's super important.
And Darren, you've been named a top 100 cyber, a CISO 30 Leadership Award winner. From what you've seen across leading CISOs, what key behaviors do they have that separate them as a world-class CISO compared to one who's stuck in a reactive state?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing, is having that strategic vision. You've got senior leaders coming into an organization who have to engage with the board, C-suite, business leaders. So they have to have some kind of strategic vision so that they can bridge cybersecurity with business risk. And typically these large-scale digital transformation strategies that are happening across the organization, we have to remember that CISOs need to be seen as, and I say CISOs, I know it's CISOs in Australia, but I split between the two because one of them I have to sometimes remember that. But that ability to help them on their business agenda is really important. And I'll give you an example, right? So in many of the organizations that I've worked in, it was important when sitting down with business leaders to understand their strategy for growing their business. And typically that meant moving into a new market, expanding the product, digitally enabling the product. So a lot of banks, by the way, would have had no banking application or app that they would use. But how could they improve that app so that it became more digitally adapted to customer requirements? That would be one thing. Helping build security into that so that it was seamless would be a really good thing. A lot of large banks as well have become digital-only banks. So you've got these digital banks that have been growing right across. I know we've had some in Australia, but certainly lots in Singapore and Hong Kong that have been involved in. But again, this is the cybersecurity teams being involved in that kind of agenda. So some of those digital banks are built on the cloud. So how would you build something like zero trust into those digital banks so that it became an enabler as well? So that became important. Just having that strategic is really important. The next thing is really having executive presence. So this is about you as a leader being able to communicate confidently with board level executives. Because ultimately, if you're not able to influence them in a positive way and have that kind of strategic impact, and this could be as simple as you go into the meetings and you're talking in technical jargon that just kind of loses. If you lose them very early on, sometimes, by the way, in a board meeting, you only have 15, 20 minutes to illustrate your point and potentially unlock funds. You might have a bit longer if you're using a new strategy. But you really need to find ways to engage them in language that they understand. So that's crucial, actually. And you can't necessarily underestimate the importance. We talk about that a lot in the Cyber Leadership Institute when we're training our cybersecurity professionals to become true leaders, visionary leaders, is able to switch away from technical jargon to business narrative. And that's super important. And by the way, in that, you have to find ways to not only engage in those committee meetings, which is obviously your crucial kind of window of opportunity, but to find ways to do that through regular stakeholder management Board members are not just to be engaged with, and senior leaders, etc., not just to be engaged with in committees, but in regular one-to-ones. So you need to do that, and you need to make sure that your team are doing that. So that stakeholder management all the way down is super important. Finding even opportunities, by the way, and maybe on a quarterly basis, to have a non-governance forum where you use that as a pure opportunity to invite senior leaders in to learn more about your security agenda. Sometimes even a 2-hour session will be a great opportunity to get that. And they do like this, by the way, because a non-governance forum is an opportunity for them to ask questions without necessarily being scrutinized or concerned about what's being taken as a kind of a note-taking session that then might even go to the regulators, actually. So those non-governance forums are really important. And then the last thing, which is something I talk about a lot because it's personal to me, but resilient leadership. CISOs, wherever, the senior head of security around the world, and you can even think about even like the next layer down. We have a global epidemic actually of senior cybersecurity professionals who are just checking out. They've had enough. It's a high stress, high stakes environment, and they're struggling to keep up. AI has just put the stakes even more. We've had many leaders who attend to drugs, alcohol, and serious mental illness. So this resilient leadership, you need senior leaders who get this, and this needs to also be driven top down from them as leaders. So senior leaders in this role, they need to be seen as advocate for resilience. So this is all about cognitive clarity, stress management, physical well-being. So you can't even underestimate the benefits. Regular exercise, eating well. I talk about things like meditation, but suggesting anybody does meditation, that's probably for another discussion. But those aspects of physical and mental health, you can even look through everything that I just talked about and go, these are all important. But I actually think if you don't get this last bit important, you can almost forget everything else, because the senior leader who turns up to work every day who is unhealthy, him or her in themselves, and is not able to talk about the benefits of physical and mental health, you're not going to add that in your team, and your team are going to break down. So if it comes top down and they take you seriously, then you're going to have a team that's thinking about resilient leadership top down, and it helps everybody relax and go, you know what? Health is my priority as well as everything else that I need to do in my job. I could talk about this topic all day, but it isn't just they're the kind of the three things: strategic vision, executive presence, and in this kind of resilient leadership. Some of the key traits that I think are required of world-class CISOs.